Welcome to episode 66 of the Headspace and Timing Podcast, a show brought to you by the Change Your POV Podcast Network. On today's show, we talk to Ken Falke, veteran, founder of Boulder Crest Retreat, co-author of a recently released book, Struggle Well, and an advocate for veteran mental health and wellness. Ken and I have a great conversation about his background, his work, and the concept of post-traumatic growth. Here's a piece of what you'll hear in the show. After that, we'll have a short break with my buddy Eddie Lazary highlighting one of the sponsors of the Change Your POV Podcast Network, and then we'll get into the conversation.
And he would sit in these groups and he kept listening and watching the growth occur and creating these, what he showed eventually in research is these outcomes of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic or a traumatic event occurs, time goes on, grieving, healing, and then this growth opportunity. And he started writing about it, and I said, I'm really intrigued by this. I said, have you ever done anything with veterans?
Many veterans separate from the military, and they want to stake their claim in this world. And hey, what better way to do that than to start your own website? Whether you want to create a blog or a niche site or a nonprofit, or hey, what about a full-blown online storefront? Well, you will want to host your site on a great platform at a reasonable price. We recommend HostGator. It's who we use here at Change Your POV Podcast Network. Web hosting made easy and affordable. Powerful website hosting services starting at only $275 a month. Check it out now by heading over to changeyourpov.com/resources. And you know what? If you don't have any website development experience, no problem. You can get started quickly and easily today. HostGator offers a website builder that provides you with an incredibly convenient drag and drop building experience. You can choose from a wide selection of themes and even pre-built sections to craft your own amazing website and publish it in no time. So check it out today by heading over to changeyourpov.com/resources.
Welcome to the Change Your POV Podcast Network. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes about veteran mental health. My name's Dwayne France, and I'm a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After I retired from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set right, however, it was just a huge useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing isn't set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support veterans, service members, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing Podcast. Once again, and as always, we really appreciate you taking the time to listen to and learn more about veteran mental health. I'm really excited about today's guest, not for many different reasons, but I've been following his work and the work of Boulder Crest Retreat for a while, and I'm really encouraged by it. But I'd like to introduce to the audience today Ken Falke. Ken, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dwayne. Good morning. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. It's like I'd mentioned before we started talking. You've been around for a while, but you really seem to be hitting a lot of things. You got a new book out, and obviously Boulder Crest is doing some great things. But before we get into that, I guess I'd like to have you tell the audience a little bit about your military background and sort of where things started at.
Yeah, sure. Well, my military background started in 1981. I enlisted in the Navy as an E1 and spent my first tour of duty in the Ceremonial Guard here in Washington, D.C., and that was a amazing tour. Over an 18-month period of time, I was stood at attention on the White House lawns and other major events, but also was a body bearer, a casket bearer, and participated in about 1,400 military funerals from dependents and spouses to 4-star, admirals and generals. So it was a great way to start my career. The ceremonial guard led me to the EOD community. I enlisted and initially in the Navy to be a Navy SEAL. When I got to boot camp, I failed an eye test that was required. SEALs had to have almost 20/20 vision, and I didn't. I had about 20/40 and 20/50 in the other eye, and at the time they weren't doing LASIK surgery. So I found out about EOD when I was in Washington, D.C. The old dive school used to be up in Washington, D.C., and we had divers living on the same base that we were at Andrews Air Force Base, and just got to know people, and went and took the test down in Indian Head, Maryland, which is where the EOD school was at the time, and passed it. And next thing I know, I was on my way to EOD school. So I spent the rest of my career as an EOD tech. I retired as an E9, a Master Chief Petty Officer out of EOD Group 1 in San Diego, where I kind of spent the last 3 years of my career really focusing on the counterterrorism stuff that I'd spent the last half of my career in supporting SEAL teams and Army Special Forces units as an EOD guy. And then this last tour in the Navy, I was able to really get focused in on the requirements business, what we needed as a force to prepare for modern day warfare. And the timing couldn't have been any better in the sense that we were preparing for the terrorist fight, which hadn't started. It started in 1999 and then 2000, with Khobar Towers and then the USS Cole. So when the IEDs started going off in, Iraq and Afghanistan, the expertise that I had gathered became pretty valuable to the counter IED community as well.
It's a pretty broad range. It always fascinates me when I talk to veterans that really straddle eras. When you came in 81, there were still Vietnam veterans. When I came in 92, of course, there were still Vietnam veterans in the force, but many fewer. And then when I was at Bragg, I think we had some Panama veterans. But you really spanned sort of the Cold War, saw what that was, and then in the beginning, and even now as you serve post 9/11 veterans. What was that like for you, spanning those different eras?
Well, it's interesting I was born in Pittsburgh, and I'm a huge fan of the Pittsburgh Pirates, and I got to see the last game at Forbes Field. I saw many baseball games at Three Rivers Stadium, and last year I got to go to the new stadium for the first time. So you start to feel a little old when you've seen three baseball stadiums. I grew up my dad left the Army and became a cop here in D.C., so I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C., in Alexandria, Virginia, in a very, very military neighborhood. Matter of fact, I think my family at one time may have been the only people on the street that weren't technically an active duty military family. So very heavy military influence in my childhood, World War II mentors that I worked for as a young kid, delivering newspapers and delivering furniture and upholstery companies. And it was really an interesting time to watch this Vietnam War, because all my senior enlisted leadership in the military, probably up until, like you said, the 90s, were Vietnam vets and warriors. And they were led, as I was and you were, by a officer corps who had no combat experience. And it's funny you asked that, because we talked about this the other day and what's going to happen now with the kind of the wind down, and you start to see the same thing historically that we saw before. And I think that led us to some major issues. Not that everybody has to be a combat veteran to be successful in the military, but I do think that it gives you a much different perspective on the reality. The garrison life's not always what it's cracked up to be, and the way leadership occurs. And I think I give a lot of talks today on PTSD and help a lot of post 9/11 veterans, and we also take in Vietnam vets. We just had 2 Vietnam vets come through our Warrior Path program here. But I tell people that PTSD is as much of a leadership issue as it is a mental health issue. And what I mean by that, and the Marine Corps have done some interesting studies on this, is that, units that are led well tend to have a much lower suicide rate than those that aren't. And there's a lot to be said, I think, for that. So, I just really hope that, the new officers and coming into the service don't do necessarily what happened, in the 80s and really allow these combat hardened veterans to be the leaders that they are and deserve to be.
No, and I can absolutely agree with that. And I think back even as you began as a ceremonial guard. I served outside of Fort Meade, Maryland for 3 years, and so I'm familiar with the area. I got to know in the Army a lot of tomb guards, but also that experience that earlier in your career, even after having grown up with a certain reverence or appreciation, that had to instill solemnity, right? Just reverence. I mean, those are ceremonial. Of course, I can't go to Arlington without hair standing up on the back of your neck, and so you were aware of the sacrifice very early on in your career.
Yeah, the 1,400 funerals, a lot of funerals, and it's I can't even count how many I've been to now. The EOD community that I came out of, we've had 133 killed in action since 9/11, and we're nearing that number in suicides, and the funerals are just horrendous.
And so, and that's you after leaving the military and still being involved in counterterrorism. You started a couple different things. The EOD Foundation, I think it was, correct?
That's correct. Yep. I ran a company called HST Solutions, which ended up growing to be, pretty big. And during the early days of HST Solutions, I had an employee that we had a little foundation inside our company that did all our kind of philanthropic work. And we had an employee who just focused on wounded EOD warrior care, all the amputees that were getting medevac back here to Walter Reed and Bethesda hospitals. And then about 2007, we actually started the Wounded EOD Warrior Foundation. And then 4 years ago, we merged it with an old legacy EOD foundation that provided scholarships to children, and really have now created this EOD Warrior Foundation. And I just came back Sunday, actually, from our annual EOD weekend. The first Saturday in May is National EOD Day, congressional mandated National EOD Day. And also, it's our annual EOD Memorial, where we place the names of those who have fallen in our career field onto this beautiful wall down at Eglin Air Force Base, which is the home of EOD School now. And, this year was the first year since 9/11 we haven't put a post-9/11 name on that wall. We did put 12 names on there. We have some historians who are doing some really interesting work. So we had 2 Navy SEALs who were also EOD qualified who were killed in the invasion of Grenada. We had a couple Vietnam vets and a bunch of World War II vets that went onto the memorial this year.
So, in touching base on that, and a lot of our audience is military, but we also have some non-military mental health providers that want to understand and learn more about military and veteran mental health. So, EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, it is a unique military occupation. I was in the 82nd, and I always said that parachute riggers who join the military knowing that they're going to be jumping out of an airplane for their entire career, you have to want to experience that, right? There's something about that. In EOD, you are volunteering for an inherently dangerous. There's no ambiguity, right? There's no. I mean, even if you're an infantryman, or a ground pounder, you may or may not be in situation. When you're EOD, it's dangerous all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only profession, really. I won't say that runs to gunfire, because I think we all do that, when the bullets start flying. But it's definitely the only profession that runs towards an IED and or an unexploded piece of ordnance on the battlefield. And I don't mean run literally, but it's a dangerous profession. It's, I think, in many cases, people say it's the most dangerous profession, but we all have our perspectives. It's kind of what led me to write this book about this whole concept of training instead of therapy. And, because we become this product of how we're trained. And one thing I love about the military and really miss about the military is the quality of training, because we do an amazing job. And you see, soldiers all the time that are just so great at their jobs because they're trained. And I think not everybody can make it through EOD school. We've proven that over the years, but I think the ones that do are very well trained and don't look at it with the level of danger that many from the outside look at.
Right, and I've seen that with veterans that I work with is once you become more comfortable with that, I talk about our doomsday clock, our own personal doomsday clock being a little closer to midnight than many others. You get comfortable with danger, you get comfortable with taking risks. And while that can be beneficial in some areas, that's not always that beneficial when service members leave the military.
No, it's really that's one of the big issues with PTSD, that hypervigilance, that hyper alert, all the things that keep us alive on the battlefield don't necessarily make for a great life, when the bullets aren't flying.
And so you started with the Wounded EOD Warrior, and then talk to me a little bit about Boulder Crest. How did that come about, and sort of what you do there?
Yeah, so since about 2004, my best friend was an Army EOD Sergeant Major. We had served together at the EOD school, and he called me in 2004 and said, "Hey, I have a soldier who's lost his legs. I know you're in D.C. I'm in Iraq. Would you meet him and his family?" And we got to the hospital, and there was no family there. And that's kind of what's the genesis of the Wounded EOD Warrior Foundation at the time. And we paid for this guy's mom. He had a mom. He had no siblings. He had no father, but he had a mom. And she was struggling to figure out how to get to the hospital. She didn't have money. She had a dog that had to get into a kennel. And we paid for her to get to the hospital and for her dog to be in the kennels and those types of things. And, as kind of a veteran of the first Gulf War, I think like everybody, I thought this thing would be over in 3 months, and it would be the first and last, EOD troop I saw laying in a bed with no legs. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. We've had about 225 severely injured EOD troops, and that's amputations, blind, burn. These are physical injuries. The invisible injuries are countless, I think, at this point, but the physical injuries were pretty substantial. And I sold my company in 2008. I ran it for a couple more years, and finally I left in 2010. I was going to take a year off and just kind of do some things around the house, and I got bored and decided to go do a master's degree at Georgetown. As an enlisted guy, I did an undergrad degree, but it was at night school, and I wanted to go, somewhere and do a master's degree. So I did a degree in public policy with some kind of vision of maybe going back into the Pentagon and helping, specifically with the Wounded Warrior issues at the time, because I was just so fed up with the way the government was handling, these guys at the hospital. The medics and the doctors were doing a great job, but the stuff that was happening with the families and the facilities at Walter Reed at the time and even at Bethesda at the time were horrendous. They've come so far, to date. But I just thought, maybe I could get back in the business of the government service and do something, interesting again. And it just so happened that year I was at Georgetown was the worst year in Afghanistan. We had gone dismounted again in Afghanistan during the surge. And from about late 2010 to early 2013, and specifically over one 52-week period in that time, we had 71 EOD amputees in 52 weeks. So, Georgetown University is on one end of Wisconsin Avenue, and the hospital, Bethesda's on the other end, and they were closing Walter Reed at this time. And I was going back and forth, like every 4 days I was meeting a new family. And most of these family members are my age, the young guys and gals that were injured were in their early 20s, most of them. And we started bringing their families just to get them away from the hospital and give them a break out to our home. And I've got a beautiful old country home in Virginia, about an hour west of the Beltway and an hour west of these two hospitals at the time. And started bringing the families out. We started with day barbecues. We had a few families stay overnight, with us, and had one dad come out and spend a week out here deer hunting with me. I mean, it was just trip after trip. And, what we know for sure is that, there's a large percentage, I think it's over 70% of the military comes from rural America. And then when these families come here to D.C., it's beside the fact the hospital and their son and daughter laying in this bed is horrendous. It's hard, when you're not a city person to be here. And the average, severely injured guy's in an inpatient status for, anywhere from 3 months to a year, depending on the severities and of these injuries and infections and things. And then the outpatient for anywhere from 1 to 3 years. So these aren't short-term stays by any means. And And I came home one night from school at Georgetown, and my wife and two of her friends were sitting at the dining room table drinking wine. And I thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. I'm going to bed. So I said, good night, ladies. And they said, no, come here. We got a great idea. This place that I own we had 200 acres. And at the bottom of the property is 37 acres of pastures. And we used to call it the meadows. And we would take our dogs down there. We had some hopes and dreams one day of putting our own horses down there. And my wife said, what do you think about donating the meadows? And instead of people coming here to our house, not that we didn't love that, but, when people are in your house, even if you say go to the fridge and get a beer, they always feel awkward. And she said, rather than being in our house, why don't we build a couple cabins down in the meadows and just let families come and stay there? And I thought, well, that's a good idea. A couple cabins isn't much. And then they showed me this drawing that they had, which is pretty much what we've built. And early on, just because of my ties to the EOD community and the Navy SEAL community, we thought we'd open it up just for those communities. And, through a variety of reasons, one main reason being I sat in the hospital bed one night with a young infantry guy who had no family or siblings. And I just thought there's no way we could just do this for anybody. So or EOD and SEAL. So we opened it up to all combat veterans and built this beautiful facility here at Boulder Crest Retreat, and that's kind of how it all got started.
So, and there's definitely a lot there that I'd like to unpack, but really to validate from the other side what you saw. I was in Afghanistan in RC East in 2009 and 2010, and there exactly what you're talking about is we were starting to wind down in 2010 was when IEDs really started cropping up in Afghanistan. In Kandahar and RC South, they were there, but where we were at in RC East, it wasn't big until our last 3 or 4 months. And of course, when IEDs come in, that's when EOD starts to come in and do things like that. I can honestly say one moment of terror that I felt in Afghanistan was when we started getting intel that copper was starting to be introduced, and EFPs might be coming into Afghanistan, and I saw what that happened, what that did in Iraq, and so that was a very different threat than what we were used to the most of that tour for direct action, and so we started seeing it when I was there on the ground too, coming in and starting to see that ramp up, and then to know that even increased after we left. That was significant. And then I'm hearing you saw a need, right? There's so many different times that you or anyone else could have intervened or not intervened. You started to notice a need. You were aware of the need with the work that you were doing. You saw an opportunity. So a lot of people may see the need and have the opportunity, but maybe don't have the will or the resources that you had. And sort of all of that came together for you to be able to provide this support at Boulder Crest Retreat.
Yeah, it's definitely, it was a perfect storm, that's for sure. And we were, we've been blessed. We were able to sell this company, and we made some money, and you just, we didn't make it on our own, and you just somebody said to me the other day, said you easily could have just left and gone and retired and gone fishing or something. Right. I thought, what a miserable life. It's like, how can you not do that? I mean, it's or how could you do that? It's I don't know. I sit there and I look at people, today, even with the invisible injuries, and I just think, we got to help. We got to help, and we got to do more, and we do as much as we can. I'm probably personally at capacity, but we're hoping to, get other people motivated about what we're doing here and try to spread this around the country. And because it's pretty frustrating the way, the veterans are taken care of, and I think it's just over and over again. You just hope that you can do more and do better. So,
and I think, and I can see even just hearing, in this brief trajectory of your military career, growing up around World War II and Vietnam veterans and seeing that, and Korean War veterans, and then very early on experiencing the reverence and the ceremonial aspect and taking care of troops. I mean, this is really something that you've been doing since '81, and it doesn't surprise me that when you saw the need there that you didn't step in and do what you could.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, and it's, I know we're going to talk a little bit about my book earlier, but I talk a little bit in the book. I lost my mom to cancer, when I was 7 years old, and the last year she was in the hospital. She was in a coma, and I sat there by her bed, with my grandmother. I talk about it in the book a little bit. My grandmother brushing her hair and just globs of hair just coming out, and it's something you never forget as a kid. And somebody said, that's probably what gave you the strength to sit next to these beds, at the hospital when you're sat with these wounded guys. And not only did I sit with these, a lot of wounded EOD guys and SEALs and Army Special Forces guys during the time, but I actually got hired in 2011 by the Pentagon to do some interviews to try to figure out what was going on, kind of a first-person perspective of their IED attacks, and which nobody had done at the time. And I think I interviewed about 130 guys who had lost limbs to IEDs or been blinded or paralyzed or severely burned. And it really opened up my eyes. And those are a lot of sad stories to sit next to a bed and listen to. So at some stage in the game, I think, you gather this strength and as I said earlier, you kind of become a sum of the training that you've had, and that's what life's all about to me.
No, I can absolutely see that, and even the idea, as you mentioned earlier, if we pull up and we see disturbed earth, and there's a HME or an IED potentially buried, me and my troops would pull back, right? We would pull off of that, and those who are trained would move forward to that. And those are the EOD, And in many ways, you're doing the same thing. You're approaching the aftermath of those things willingly moving forward, where others may, and to no fault of their own, but not knowing how to deal with it or not being familiar with that would naturally pull away and think, well, someone else is more qualified to handle this young man or young woman's injury or things like that, where in many ways, you're still doing what you did when you were in the military.
Yeah, no, I think it's it's a job of a senior NCO. I think to take care of the troops, and you just find this comfort zone in your life, and not that I don't mind getting outside my comfort zone, but I think I found what I'm good at this point.
Now with Boulder Crest Retreat, and we hear many things about camping in the mountains, and not to be disrespectful to many of the programs that are out there, but yours is focused on recovery. There you have some clinical advisors. You have a wide range of individuals who are clinical mental health professionals. This is one of the things that I always try to explain to people. If you're starting a program, especially if it's dealing with PTSD and veteran mental health, you need to ensure that mental health professionals are involved. You can't just take a veteran out to camp and say, okay, it's great. So I guess talk a little bit about Boulder Crest's programs, and it's non-clinical, but then it's clinically informed. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair assumption. I'll tell you just the quick story is in the first year that we had Boulder Crest open, remember we opened this place up in Virginia really for families to have respite from the hospital. That was the main mission of it. And then my wife and I had donated some money to some really interesting small organizations. And we kind of, in our minds, we had kind of classified small nonprofits as $1 million a year in revenue or less. And we had donated some money to some really interesting groups. One of them is a program called Songwriting with Soldiers. And Songwriting with Soldiers brings in these professional Nashville and Austin, based songwriters, and sit down with soldiers and listen to stories and turn the stories into the most amazing songs you've maybe ever heard in a very short period of time. And there were no mental health professionals. It was just, these hippie songwriters sitting around with soldiers and really creating these cool bonds and doing some amazing things. But it didn't last. What happens in these programs is, as you said, that I call a lot of them catch and release programs, where they just bring veterans in, they go camping, they go hunting, they go fishing, and then it's they're back out on their own and they're back into life. And I don't say that about Songwriting with Soldiers specifically, because we do have a follow up. I actually joined their board early on, and we have a follow up program. But there's a lot of programs that we did host here. That brought with them a pretty interesting set of characters, and maybe no complete disrespect, maybe some wackos, and we sat back and I kept thinking, well, this is kind of interesting. Some of these many of these programs are much alike. The things that make them a little bit unique are the people, and I'd start asking questions like, well, can you scale this? Do you think we could do better? Do you think there's anything we could do in the way of lessons learned to help the mental health community, because the average therapist out there, as you know, Dwayne, the average person out there doesn't get, other than their continuing educations, they're not in this pipeline, like of research and development and what's the next greatest things. They're trained in a technique and they go out and do their best to deliver that technique, and they gather their experience over the years. But, until you get to the PhD level and start doing some research, unless you're a real innovator, that's pretty much what happens on a daily basis. And that's kind of what we saw here. And, maybe the unique feature was somebody was doing acupuncture. And then, half the guys would come out with their ears bleeding and pissed off, and the other half would come out feeling good. And I'm like, well, that's not very cool. And I, just to back up a little bit, in 1989, I broke my back in a parachute jump down in Puerto Rico. And I got out, of the hospital, and I went to physical therapy, and I had an E3. She must have been right out of hospital corpsman school doing my physical therapy. And, God bless her, but she just didn't have any experience. And I'd lay there on the table, and I'd get up, and they'd hook some electrodes to my back. And she said, all right, Chief, here's another bottle of Motrin 800s. Go kill your stomach again. And, you'd get up and walk out of these things. And finally, I borrowed a little money from my dad, and I went to a chiropractor. And in 1989, chiropractic treatment was like witch doctory. So, I've got a pretty open mind when it comes to alternative solutions, because I credit, initially I was told I would never go back to active duty. And I credit my healing and the rest of my successful career to this chiropractic treatment and a lot of my own hard work. But, it gave me a whole different perspective on getting better. And at some point in 2013, we just said, I'm not going to have any other groups come in here unless, they're solid. I can't deal with this wacko stuff anymore. I'm afraid they're going to hurt people. Why don't we start to put our own program together? So I jumped on a plane and literally flew around the country. I went to Harvard, University of Chicago, University of San Francisco, out to Pathways Home out in Napa Valley, a tragedy that, occurred out there a few weeks ago or a few months ago now. And sat with Fred Guzman, the guy that founded Pathways Home, and some of the best psychologists and psychiatrists. And I would hear these things like, PTSD Center of Excellence I was at, and I would hear these things like, well, the PTSD treatments don't really work, and we really wish we had something different. And I asked this one doctor in San Francisco, I said, if PTSD treatments aren't working for, combat veterans, why do we keep doing them? And you'd hear things like, well, it's the only thing we have. It's the only thing that insurance reimburses for, and we know that great therapists have great results, but the average therapist isn't great. The average soldier doesn't put up with not great, so they walk out of the treatments. And if you don't get through the treatments, you're damn sure not going to get better. And I finally said, to this one doctor, I said, that's just a terrible excuse. I'm a bomb disposal guy. We just don't. I didn't grow up in a profession where you can continue to make mistakes. We've got to do something about this. So I started seeking out some really meaningful people. Mary Jo Barrett up at the Center for Contextual Change in Chicago. And then I met Rich Tedeschi. I had researched, positive psychology and post-traumatic growth. And I was very intrigued by post-traumatic growth. And I found Tedeschi down at UNC Charlotte. And I had read a lot of his research, and I said to Rich, I said, I really get what you've done, and I don't know how familiar you are with post-traumatic growth, but Tedeschi's early work was really working with bereaved parents, families who had lost children to cancer, and he would sit in these groups, and he kept listening and watching the growth occur and creating these, what he showed eventually in research is these outcomes of post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic or a traumatic event occurs, time goes on, grieving, healing, and then this growth opportunity. And he started writing about it. And I said, I'm really intrigued by this. I said, have you ever done anything with veterans? And he said, yeah, actually my colleague and I, his colleague was Lawrence Calhoun at the time at UNC, studied prisoners of war from the Vietnam War. And he said, well, what? And I said, well, what did you find out? And he said, well, 30% of Vietnam era veterans came home with PTSD, which arguably, depending on the statistics you believe in, is true for our current generation. And he said, well, what do you think the percentage of POWs who came home with PTSD is? And I said, I don't know, 100%. I'm thinking, I've been in combat, I've been to SEER school, and I'm thinking, what's worse than getting caught on the battlefield and captured and tortured, let alone for a day, by ISIS and then killed the next day or had your head chopped off. But 591 days, 10 years. I mean, some of the, 591 men that, walked out of prison camps in Vietnam. And I said, it's got to be 100%. And he said, no. And I said, 50. And, we kind of played that game. And he held up 4 fingers and said, no, 4%. And I said, well, how the hell do you, account for that? And the first thing he said to me was training. And I said, well, and I had read when I was in SEER school and I had read some other stuff about Stockdale's leadership in these camps, or specifically in the Hanoi Hilton. And he said, they had created a framework, they had trained each other, they had relied on each other, they, kind of went through this whole kind of framework, what today we call the Stockdale paradox. And I said, that's amazing. I said, do you think we could teach people how to achieve post-traumatic growth? And he said, Ken, I'm not sure, but I'm all ears and I'm willing to help. And that's kind of what started our journey. And we created this Warrior Path program. One of the things we talked about a minute ago was this catch and release concept. I didn't want to do anything that was short term or short duration. So we really looked hard at creating a military style training program. Some people have referred to it as kind of a reverse boot camp kind of concept. But most importantly was that we weren't going to catch and release, and that we would follow up with the men and women for 18 months, which we felt was long enough. We had read a lot on habitual change. Some people say it takes 21 days to create change. Other people say it takes up to a year. And we just thought, well, if it takes a year, let's add 6 months, and we'll figure by 18 months, we'll hope that, that our program is working well enough. And to date, the results are amazing. I mean, we're in the middle of, not even in the middle now, we're at the end, 17 months into an 18-month longitudinal study. And the results we're getting in this program are far outpacing status quo.
And I really like that, especially the hopefulness. A lot of veterans are told that PTSD is a life sentence, and that you have to just accept and acknowledge what your limitations are. And you mentioned positive psychology. At the end of my career, I was actually trained as the Army's Master Resilience Training. So I went to UPenn and studied or went through their training under Dr. Karen Rivich and Martin Seligman. And so very familiar with Dr. Tedeschi and Calhoun in the post-traumatic growth. Actually written about it a couple times on the blog, one of them through the other side of the Valley of Death. And I'll make sure that links in the show notes. But post-traumatic growth is a less often discussed outcome of experiencing trauma or experiencing stress. Can you maybe give a little bit of your understanding of what post-traumatic growth is?
No, I'm a big believer in the concept. So let's look. Let's go all the way forward and look at kind of some of the outcomes of post-traumatic growth, and that's really identified in 5 ways in the framework. The first one is kind of new opportunities or possibilities in our life, that hope we talked about. I held a conference for the EOD Warrior Foundation. I mentioned that we've had almost as many suicides, if not maybe even more, than we've had KIA since 9/11, including 206s, 2 fairly senior officers. And I held a conference here at Boulder Crest Retreat just for the EOD community and brought in all these top experts in suicide, which, I'm not really sure truthfully what that means. But what I walked out of after a 2-day conference was that suicide is really a disease of hopelessness. So if we're not creating hope and new possibilities in people's lives, what we're going to do is doomed to fail, right? Because that's what leads us down this road. So the first, outcome of post-traumatic growth is creating this hope, these new opportunities, and what are these new possibilities. The next one is the increased sense of personal strength. I tell people that, the military is the epitome of post-traumatic growth, right? You come into boot camp, we shave your head, we take everything away from you, and we turn you in, from a civilian to a soldier or to a sailor, to an airman or a Marine. That's a big deal. What we do in a very short period of time to transform a human being in the military is a big deal. And we create this strength, and not that PTSD is a weakness by any means, but how do you get back to that feeling? And that's what I tell these young guys when I come through. I said, remember this military bearing. When I'm talking about military bearing, I tell them, I don't care about your long hair and your beards and your earrings, and if you're smoking a little dope, that stuff doesn't bother me. But don't forget what made you, the man you are. And I tell everybody today, I mean, my dad, my grandfather, my mentors, and the U.S. Navy made me the man I am. And you can't forget that. And how do you increase that sense of personal strength, and what's the outcome of that, during a program? The other thing is a change in relationships. We're humans. We thrive on relationships. You come home as a veteran and you hate everybody and hate yourself. It's because you hate yourself, not because you hate other people. The way to get through life is to have meaning and positive relationships. So how do we create these positive ones? And sometimes it's hard, right? It's getting these toxic people out of our life, family members and friends. And it's not always easy to do that. The next one is just a sense of greater appreciation for life. In general terms, do you really appreciate life and what's happening with your life? And then the last one is this kind of deepening of a spiritual life. And I'm not a religious man by any means, but I think at the end of the day, if you don't believe in something bigger than yourself, that ego is going to drive you to a bad place. So that's kind of the outcomes of post-traumatic growth. And then what we found and what Tedeschi worked with us on is how do you create that through teachings. And the first thing, very similar to what you do as a counselor and others do as therapists, is education. This whole concept of psychoeducation. What's going on in your body? Why are you in this state that you're in? And to really educate the details of what symptoms of PTSD are, how it's treated, what certain drugs may do and may not do for you, why sleep is so important, and nutrition and exercise and all this stuff. But this whole education process. The next thing is regulation. And we tell everybody, if you can't self-regulate, you self-medicate. And once you go down that road, it gets to be almost impossible to get out of. I mean, we have over a 90% recidivism rate in alcohol and drug rehab. We spend billions of dollars a year in alcohol and drug rehab. And if you're in that situation, talk about a life sentence. I mean, the chance of getting better is 10%. So once you go down that road and you get severely addicted, and listen, I've sat on my couch here at Boulder Crest Retreat with a young Marine who was a hell of a Marine, Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, detoxing on heroin. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. So, for me, is this medication problem that we have in the mental health world is something we've got to get our hands around. So self-regulation is the next kind of phase of PTG teachings. The next one is disclosure. And as you know, as a counselor, many of us bring a lot of baggage into the military with us. This stuff starts at childhood. We become the sum, right? So what I've learned is that we can't just focus on the combat experience. Because most of the time, as a veteran or as a combat soldier, that's where we thrive. And although those things are sad, they're meaningful, they leave marks, they leave nightmares. Part of the reason that we can't go beyond that is because we've already got a rucksack full of trauma that we carried into the military. Adverse childhood experiences, sexual trauma, physical abuse, poverty, the things that the soldiers join the military for to get away from. And all that stuff has to be disclosed. It's got to come off your chest. And, the shame, the guilt, the labels, those types of things. And then the next phase of PTG is just creating this new story. What is it? As some people say, live in the dash, right? We're very proud when we die to put our birth dates and our death dates on our tombstone, but this dash where we live our lives is so important. So we work with guys to create stories about the new man that they want to be or the new woman that they want to be in, and how do you get from where you are today to be that person? Because, there might be one or two in the audience, but very few people in life want to be known as an asshole. And that's what we find when we create these new stories. And how do you implement that in your life in the way of setting goals and achieving those goals? And then the last way is service. And specifically, we talk about service to others, because that's very important. Again, when we measure spirituality at Boulder Crest Retreat in our Warrior Path program, we talk about 3 things: your character, your ability to create positive relationships in your life, and service to others. And that's really what spirituality to us is. And if in there you believe in a God, if you believe in anything else, God bless you and good for you. But at the end of the day, those are the three core principles of what, define the spirituality, and service is just so important. And again, many of us join. They call it the military service for a reason. Many of us join to serve a nation, serve something bigger than ourselves. And if you come home from war and you're not serving anybody but yourself, and especially in a negative way, it becomes very difficult. So those are the five kind of phases and teachings of post-traumatic growth. It's not as Tedeschi always reminds us, it's not a mechanistic process. Education, regulation, disclosure, news story, service, all this stuff is kind of interwoven. There's education throughout it. You always have to self-regulate. Those are the kind of things that happen. So that's really what PTG is all about.
See, and I think that's critical for a lot of veterans, especially the ones that I see, is when I start to talk to them about post-traumatic growth, they've never heard about it before. They've never been told that there is another option, or that there's another potential outcome from their traumatic experiences. As you said, not just their military traumatic experiences, or even before, how you talked about leadership and PTSD. A toxic leadership can develop these different things, separate from PTSD, but just emotional depression, anxiety, and things like that. But when I talk to veterans about post-traumatic growth, they're like, there's this new concept. They're sitting there, in the thorn bushes at the bottom of the hill, beaten and bloody, and they think that this is it. This is the rest of my life, until someone is able to come along and say, but this is how you can get to the path to live that post-military life that you desire. So that's really great. I really appreciate you laying that out like that.
Yeah, and I appreciate you working it into your sessions too, Dwayne, because Dr. Brett Moore, who's on our wellness advisory committee, is a former Army psychologist. He was embedded. I think he was embedded in Iraq longer than any other psychologist. One of the first guys during the embedded mental health testing that they did over in Iraq. And Brett was telling me he was interviewing a soldier one day, and they were going through what had happened on the battlefield, the death, the destruction, and all that. And the soldier looked up at him and said, "Doc, every time I talk to you, all you want to know about is the bad things." He goes, "I kind of think something good's happening out of this." And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" And that's what led Brett Moore to Dr. Tedeschi, because Brett saw it firsthand with growth. And that's one of the things. Somebody asked me the other day, "Well, how the hell do you scale Warrior Path?" There's no way we can put everybody through Warrior Path, and we understand that, and we know it. But what we can do is help get these teachings of post-traumatic growth out, because the minute, if you're in a prolonged exposure session or CPT or CBT process, and you start to talk about growth and new possibilities, it can take that process, that traditional treatment, and really add the juice to it to get people motivated and energized. And that's where the real success occurs. And that's one of the ways we hope to be able to help, is to just start teaching, the concepts of post-traumatic growth out and around this community.
Well, and that's in exactly what you were talking about before, it not being a mechanistic situation where we have our protocols for CPT or CBT or things like that. But much of what Dr. Tedeschi and Seligman, but even going back to Irvin Yalom, is a lot of it has the purpose and meaning aspect, the existential aspect laid on top of these things can really help. And then you said really trying to get the word out. And as we wrap up here, that's really what the book is about. As when we record this, your book, Struggle Well, has been out for a couple of weeks now. By the time we air this, it'll actually be a couple of months. And to me, that seems like your way of trying to get this out into the community, get these tenets, these aspects of post-traumatic growth out into the wider veteran community and clinical community.
Yeah, no, that's a great assessment. I mean, I think we get asked this question a lot, because we're starting to publish our results of our 18-month study, and we'll get asked these questions. Well, do you think this would work for civilians? And we're like, well, absolutely. And people ask us, well, how do we know that? And one is we've put civilians through our program, some first responders, an NFL football player, and a lot, although they're not true civilians in my eyes, a lot of military spouses. And what we said was, how do you get this word out to a bigger and broader audience in a short period of time? So we spent the last year, really spent the last 4 years, but the last year hard at writing the book, and it's called Struggle Well, Thriving in the Aftermath of Trauma. It really was written with this concept of trying to, there just seems like there's a funk in the United States. I mean, we have 20 veterans a day that take their own lives. And it was 20 veterans last year. A couple of years ago it was 20, and the year before it was 20. And I'm like, that number should be going down. If what we were doing was right, it should be going down. Suicide in general terms, 123 a day on average. Suicide in general terms is the only cause of death in the United States that's on the rise. Opioid addiction. We kept thinking, well, the country seemed to be in a bit of a funk. What can we do as leaders, maybe in the space, to kind of help share the word? So for my civilian friends that are listening, don't be turned off by the strong soldier on the front cover of our book. It's for everybody, and we really do hope it helps. And we've got a website and contact information, strugglewell.com, if you want to get hold of Josh or I co-authored the book with Josh Goldberg, who's a great friend of mine and kind of my right-hand man here at Boulder Crest. So anything we can do to help, and that's all we're trying to do is help. So anything we can do to help, please reach out to us.
And I think it's critically important. Exactly what you were talking about is, if we're focusing on veterans. But what I've seen in my work over the last 3 or 4 years, that if we can figure out a solution for veterans, we can then apply that to non-veterans, not just in the mental health space, but in the homelessness space. I did a lot of work in that a couple years ago, that if we can figure out how to, not solve veterans homelessness, but make an impact on veteran homelessness, we can then extrapolate that to other populations. And the same thing here. Post-traumatic growth was not something that was designed specifically, even as you were talking about with Dr. Tedeschi, the veteran, the applications for veterans emerged out of his studies. Same thing with Seligman and what he was doing with positive psychology, is the impact on veterans emerged out of something that was already working for civilians. And so I think it's, and as we all know, military service is a microcosm of our nation. We have people from all walks of life, socioeconomic status, as you said, rural primarily, but also so I think that it really can be, this is what works here, and this is also what can work elsewhere. So I really appreciate, especially bringing that out, that this isn't just a veteran book that veterans need to read, any more than Tribe. Sebastian Junger's book Tribe is not just a veteran book for veterans, or even, to a much lesser extent mine, is not specifically just for veterans. Anybody can, if they want to understand more about veteran mental health and how to help veterans, that it can really be applied in across the broad range of society. Yeah,
absolutely. I think because the thing we've got to quit doing, I think, in this space is labeling people. I think people need to educate. The more wisdom you can create in your life and for yourself, the better you'll be and the better life you'll live. My favorite book, at least up until the one I just wrote, was I'm just joking, was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And I think Absolutely. That we talk about existential change and asking these questions, and two very important questions that kind of take you down one path or the other is the question of why, which Frankl talks about, questioning everything, really fully understanding what's going on. Don't let a doctor just give you medications after medication. Understand what's going on and ask the question why, and get away from this victimhood. As Secretary Mattis says, victimhood is exalted in this country, and veterans should not become a part of it. And that question is, why me? You think it's a black cloud following you. I can almost guarantee you that black cloud is because you've created it. And that's what has to happen. And, the last thing I'll say, Dwayne, I stand in front of a lot of post 9/11 veterans, and I tell them all the time, you're at a fork in the road where you either become the most entitled generation or the next greatest generation. And how that occurs is really up to you guys and not up to me. We can help train and we can do it, but at the end of the day, I firmly believe life is a choice, and all these choices that are made are nobody's fault, but your own. So, there's people out here to help, and if you don't ask for that help, it's just not going to work. So let's work together to create the next greatest generation. That's really what we're all about.
No, I absolutely agree. Considering the fact that I have written and speak about much of the same thing, about the fact that there is a group of veterans who seem to have transitioned in spite of what they experienced, and that they're surviving and even thriving, and then another group of veterans of our current era who are not. And so I explain it as we're having two groups, one being the lost generation of post-World War I, and the next we do have the potential to be this century's greatest generation. So I really appreciate that you brought that out. I knew that when we started talking, we could probably do this all day. But to be able to bring it to a close, I'll definitely make sure that the link to the book and, of course, Boulder Crest is in the show notes. But if people want to reach out to you, maybe there's some social media or anything like that.
Yeah, no, I'm wide open on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter. Not that great on Twitter, but LinkedIn and Facebook, and I'm pretty accessible. It's Ken Falke, Falke. And my email address is simply ken@strugglewell.com. And like I said, you can get to us through the website as well.
All right. Like I said, I'll make sure that all of those contacts are in the show notes, and that people can follow up and see what you're doing. We didn't even get to the fact that you're opening up another or have another retreat here in Arizona. In the western part of the country, right?
Yeah, we got a great big grant from the Clark family here in D.C. last year, and we bought a beautiful ranch just south of Tucson, Arizona, between Tucson and Fort Huachuca, in a small town called Sonoyta. And we're up and running. We'll probably be up and running fully next year, but we are up and running. We're running Warrior Path programs there now, and some other smaller retreats. So if anybody's in need, anybody's listening that needs a program, please reach out to Boulder Crest retreat, and we'll get you through the intake process.
Yeah, we'll have to find you some real estate in the Rockies, then you can really get things going. But
that sounds great.
Well, I appreciate it, Ken. I really appreciate taking the time to talk today.
All right, Dwayne. Thanks for everything you're doing, man. You're doing a great job.
Appreciate it. You're listening to Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV podcast network. It was really great that Ken was able to make the time to come on the show. As I mentioned, I've been seeing and hearing the great stuff that Boulder Crest Retreat has been doing, and I've been very impressed. Ken demonstrates that you don't have to be a mental health professional in order to engage and support veteran mental health. On the contrary, it was his lived experience, his military leadership, and his compassion for his fellow veterans that led him to do something to make an impact. He didn't just go out and do it on his own, however. He did seek out and get support from mental health professionals across the country, as he mentioned in the conversation. One of the key things that I hope you took away from our conversation is that combat or traumatic exposure does not automatically doom a service member to a life of anguish and pain. Improvement and growth is a critical component to anyone's life, and just because we've been through flood and fire doesn't mean that we're going to drown and burn. We, veterans, have the capacity to be as much and even more than we were when we were in the service. The outcomes of post-traumatic growth that Ken mentioned are critical. I've seen it in the clients that I work with in therapy, and I've even experienced it myself. New opportunities in our post-military life, an increased sense of personal support, a positive change in our relationships, definitely a greater appreciation for life, and absolutely a deepening in spiritual life. Ken said that he's not very religious, and you don't have to be, as he mentioned. I do happen to me, and we may talk about that in a future episode. But spiritual fitness is as important as mental, emotional, and physical fitness. Post-traumatic growth is very much a path to get balance in each of these things. Don't forget, for the last couple months, I've been giving away free books to organizations that partner directly with veterans. This month's partner is Operation TBI Freedom, a nonprofit in Colorado Springs that provides peer support and case management with veterans who have experienced traumatic brain injury. If you want to learn more about the organization, go to veteranmentalhealth.org/organization. If you want to support their work with veterans, head on over to veteranmentalhealth.com/combat-vet-book and pick up a copy. Also, over the past couple months, we've been telling you about some of the things we're trying to do to spread the word about veteran mental health and wellness, and we're trying to get this information out to you as much as we can. Started to develop content for your Echo device, and we've got some good stuff in there and more on the way. You can get a daily update about veteran mental health, explore different concepts around it, and now the entire Change Your POV podcast network catalog, nearly 500 episodes, can be found on your smart speaker. And the latest addition to the group is a skill that you can use as a companion to the latest Change Your POV podcast book, Motivation Monday Volume 1. To see them all and more to come, check out veteranmentalhealth.com/skills. And finally, thanks to this week's sponsors, HostGator. If you have an idea of a great website but don't have the tech skills to pull it off, you don't have to let the idea go. Check out HostGator to get it out of your head and in front of the audience you want to reach. You can find out more about them and all the things that help us do what we do at changeyourpov.com/resources. Make sure to tune in next week to listen to a conversation that's near and dear to my heart, the intersection between veteran mental health and one of the challenges that veterans face after leaving the military, involvement in the criminal justice system. I have a conversation with defense attorney Kevin Snyder about veteran courts and how they're changing the lives of veterans across the nation. Here's a quick preview.
The goal of the court is to, in the end, help rehabilitate the veteran and have them succeed moving forward. In order to do that, veteran treatment courts will provide some incentives such as reduction in offenses, or there could be an early expungement or a dismissal of charges, so that the incident, the criminal case, doesn't hang over the veteran's head and disadvantage them the rest of their life. And the idea is because of their service, they have gotten to this point in their life that has led to an offense. And if we're able to address some of their needs as a result of their service, then they're less likely to reoffend.
So there you have it. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. And until then, stay focused and be well. I'd like to thank the Change Your POV Podcast Network for hosting this show and highlighting the critical importance of veteran mental health. We want to hear from you. You can reach out to me via email at dwayne@veteranmentalhealth.com. You can find me at Twitter at @TheCounselingVet, or head on over to Facebook and look for the Change Your POV Squad. You can find the show notes for this episode and all the episodes by going to veteranmentalhealth.com or changeyourpov.com. Sign up for updates on either or both so you don't miss another episode. While you're at it, check out the other great shows on the Change Your POV Podcast Network. The show about remembering our military history and reviving our warrior spirit, changing hearts and minds. The show about outdoor activities that us veterans love so much, Neophyte in the Woods. The show that helps us get going at the beginning of the week, Motivation Monday. And Attack Fridays, the show that brings you actionable tips, tricks, and coachable knowledge to help you make the best of your transition. While you're checking out the other shows, drop us a review in iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're listening to. The reviews really help spread the word about what we're doing. If you're looking for the total package for all the information you need to live the life you want after leaving the military, you found it. If you know of a buddy who's looking for the same info, share it with them so they can find it too. I want to thank Doc Todd for his permission to use his track Not Alone from his amazing album Combat Medicine. Doc Todd is somebody who's trying to bring veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can get the album by going to therealdoctodd.com. Check it out. Because remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life so demanding, so much pain on this planet. I hurt each time my way, but with you I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every nail that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision LASIX, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life so demanding, so much pain on this planet. I
guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.
Oh, I try so